Okay, so we're continuing on in our final unit here. And I like to save this unit for last because I think it tackles some of those big questions that we all have in our lives, right? Where do we come from? Why are we here? Do we have free will? How the hell are we supposed to live? How are we supposed to view all of this stuff? Last class, we got one potential answer to that, or at least kind of an answer. Helen Keller was trying to tell us that we need to view life optimistically, that we need to have hope, because without it, we're not going to be able to get anything done. We need to presume that there's some stuff in the world that we can do, that we have some power, that things aren't out to destroy or annihilate us, but that we have the ability within us to actually make a change. Well, we're looking at an even more famous essay today. Not even the whole essay, just a small excerpt from it by Bertrand Russell. And Bertrand Russell was a really influential thinker, logician, philosopher of mathematics in the 20th century. And today we're looking at just a few pages from A Free Man's Worship. And in this essay, what we're going to see is Russell providing us with another perspective on these questions, another worldview, or perhaps another orientation that we might embody to achieve a meaningful, fulfilling life. So what I'd like to do, like last time, although this isn't going to be the case for all the readings in this unit, is just read through this with you. Talk about it, see what you all think, see what feelings are popping up. So let's start. We'll start with just the brief introduction here. A Free Man's Worship, first published as The Free Man's Worship in December 1903, is perhaps Bertrand Russell's best known and most reprinted essay. Its mood and language have often been explained, even by Russell himself, as reflecting a particular time in his life. It depends, he wrote in 1929, upon a metaphysic which is more Platonic than that which I now believe in. Yet the essay sounds many characteristic Russellian themes and preoccupations, and deserves consideration, and further serious study, as a historical landmark of the early 20th century European thought. And so, we begin with Russell's writing. To Dr. Faustus in his study, Mephistopheles told the history of creation, saying, "The endless praises of the choirs of angels had begun to grow wearisome. For, after all, did he not deserve their praise? Had he not given them endless joy? Would it not be more amusing to obtain undeserved praise, to be worshipped by beings whom he tortured?" He smiled inwardly and resolved that the great drama should be performed. For countless ages, the hot nebula whirled aimlessly through space. At length it began to take shape. The central mass threw off planets, and planets cooled. Boiling seas and burning mountains heaved and tossed. From black masses of cloud, hot sheets of rain deluged the barely solid crust. And now the first germ of life grew in the depths of the ocean, and developed rapidly in the fructifying warmth into vast forest trees, huge ferns springing from the damp mold, sea monsters breeding, fighting, devouring, and passing away. And from the monsters, as the play unfolded itself, man was born, with the power of thought, the knowledge of good and evil, and the cruel thirst for worship. And man saw that all is passing in this mad, monstrous world, that all is struggling to snatch, at any cost, a few brief moments of life before death's inexorable decree. And man said, "There is a hidden purpose, could we but fathom it, and the purpose is good. For we must reverence something, and in the visible world there is nothing worthy of reverence." And man stood aside from the struggle, resolving that God intended harmony to come out of chaos by human efforts. And when he followed the instincts which God had transmitted to him from his ancestry of beasts of prey, he called it sin, and asked God to forgive him. But he doubted whether he could be justly forgiven, until he invented a divine plan by which God's wrath was to have been appeased. And seeing the present was bad, he made it yet worse, that thereby the future might be better. And he gave God thanks for the strength that enabled him to forego even the joys that were possible. And God smiled. And when he saw that man had become perfect in renunciation and worship, he sent another sun through the sky, which crashed into man's sun, and all returned again to nebula. Yes, he murmured, it was a good play. I will have it performed again. What is Russell describing here? What do you think's going on? This is a hypothetical story, speculative, but what's going on here?
Essentially, it's like the creation of humans in reality, and how that creation got split when man was created, because then that was the creation of humans. There's perversion.
Right. Yeah, he's putting forth a creation story here, right? And which creation story is he echoing? Although he's put his own spin on it. Is this the Aztec creation story? Christian creation story, right? And what is that story? Well, according to that story, God created everything, right? Eventually created human beings, breathed the breath of life into them. For some untold amount of time, the first human beings lived together in harmony in the Garden of Eden, but then they fell away from God, right? This is what's known as the fall into sin. By disobeying God, sin entered the world, and with sin, death. And what was necessary to rescue human beings from this terrible fate? Well, according to the Christians, Jesus, right? Jesus coming into the world, living a perfect life, suffering and dying for our sins. You know the whole thing, right? But what do we get a glimpse into here that perhaps is not told to us in the Bible? Yes?
It's this idea of a cyclical thing where it's once man becomes the perfect worshiper, then God blows everything up again, and then it restarts.
Yeah, so there's a few different ideas being invoked here. What we get is some kind of version of the Christian story. That much is clear. But what we also see from this perspective is some kind of glimpse into God's intentions, how God set up all this stuff, right? We see the explanation of the origins of these things as kind of scientific, right? He discusses the nebula swirling and planets forming and all these different things. We even see kind of evolution being implied here, right? Where it discusses, and when he followed the instincts which God had transmitted to him from his ancestry of beasts of prey, right? But then another main idea here is that actually the creation and the destruction of at least our solar system, if not the universe, is cyclical. This is a very different kind of view than a lot of people have, right? There are some contemporary scientists and thinkers who believe that what we're going to experience far into the future is something like a big crunch, right? Where the universe is going to come back together, and then it's going to explode again in another big bang, and this is a cycle that's going to keep on repeating itself. We have a cyclical view of history. And apparently, according to this perspective, this frame, God is setting things up in this way because, well, he's trying to get something out of humans, right? He's trying to get them to be the perfect worshipers, the ones who are going to obey him. And so what we see is the origin of humanity, which has certain characteristics which we've seen in some of our other works already, right? The power of thought, we have reason, reflection, we can plan, we can analyze, knowledge of good and evil. For some reason, humans have the ability to discern morality and immorality. What we saw in Kant was animals can't be moral beings. They don't have that capacity, right? And perhaps they can't do moral or immoral things. But that the universe in which they find themselves is in flux. All is passing in this mad, monstrous world. And that humans were trying to snatch at any cost a few brief moments of life before their inevitable demise. This view that everything is changing, everything is in flux, is one that we see in the ancient thinker Heraclitus, who once famously said, "You cannot step into the same river twice, because it is not the same person stepping in the river, and it's not the same river." Okay, but let's continue on. So, mankind achieves something. They're able to resist temptations and the passions of the flesh, right? Forgo the joys that were possible. And God smiled when he saw that man had become perfect in renunciation and worship, giving themselves over to his will. And God ends it and says, "But it was a good play. I will have it performed again." Such, Russell says, in outline, but even more purposeless, more devoid of meaning, is the world which science presents for our belief. Amid such a world, if anywhere, our ideals henceforward must find a home. That man is the product of causes which had no provision of the end they were achieving, that his origin, his growth, his hopes and fears, his loves and his beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms, that no fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual life beyond the grave, that all the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system, and that the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. All these things, if not quite beyond dispute, are yet so nearly certain that no philosophy which rejects them can hope to stand. Only within the scaffolding of these truths, only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built. Okay, so now what is he presenting for us in this paragraph? What kind of worldview does Russell hold to? What kind of worldview does he think that we should look at ourselves through and understand ourselves through? Not the Christian worldview, but I told you he was a philosopher of mathematics, right? A logician, logical thinker. If you think back to our first unit and looked at some of those metaphysics again, what view do you think he's proposing here?
I don't know if this is right, but the line that says no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual's life kind of reminds
reminds me like of existential viewpoints, just because it's not the belief that like we can live a life like in heaven after this life, like we just accept death.
Right. Yeah, there's definitely an idea here that, look, we're all going to die, and our solar system is going to die too. Right? So what view would those ideas be
I guess
within?
kind of like deterministic in a way, because it's like it's saying like there's parts of our lives that we have like no control over, which is like our like ultimate fate, like death. Like there's nothing we can do to not die.
Right. What view did we look at, which was deterministic, materialistic, evolutionary?
Rationalism?
Not rationalism. It's the view that often gets contrasted with religion. What do people think the opposite of religion is? Science. Right. This is the contemporary scientific worldview, right? And so what's a part of that? We are not made or designed with any purpose. Okay? Our existence, you might say, is a cosmic accident. It wasn't designed by a God. We find ourselves in this crazy universe which is governed by these natural physical laws. But there's no purpose. There isn't an objective meaning to our lives. Okay? This is the world which science presents for our belief. That man is the product of causes which had no provision of the end they were achieving. So, this stuff wasn't designed by an almighty creator. Things are just following natural laws. They're just going about doing their thing. That his origin, his growth, his hopes and fears, all of this stuff are but the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms. And that no amount of striving against our physical condition is going to save us from death. Right? We're all going to die. So we might say it's materialistic, deterministic, and we're all going to experience death. Individually, collectively, our solar system as well. Right? This is what science teaches us. Eventually, what's going to happen to our sun? It's going to blow up. Right? And it's going to go through a bunch of stages before that, and we know, according to scientific observation, that the universe is expanding. Everything that you see out in the night sky is moving away from us. Far into the future, we are not going to be able to see any lights in the sky. Why? The distance will be so vast that light will not be able to reach us anymore. And the night sky will be completely dark. Supposing we live that long. We probably won't. Yes, he's describing for us the contemporary scientific worldview. And he says, if these things are not beyond dispute, they are yet so nearly certain that no philosophy which rejects them can hope to stand. And we need to base our lives, he says, on these observations and these theories, this worldview. And so we're getting a little glimpse into the orientation that Russell is going to provide for us today. Resting our lives, our beliefs, our views in science, reason, observation. Okay, Let's continue on. Let's see what else he says. How, in such an alien and inhuman world, can so powerless a creature as man preserve his aspirations untarnished? A strange mystery it is that nature, omnipotent but blind in the revolutions of her secular hurryings through the abyss of space, has brought forth at last a child, subject still to her power, but gifted with sight, with knowledge of good and evil, with the capacity of judging all the works of his unthinking mother. In spite of death, the mark and seal of the parental control, man is yet free, during his brief years, to examine, to criticize, to know, and in imagination to create. To him alone in the world with which he is acquainted, this freedom belongs. And in this lies his superiority to the resistless forces that control his outward life. The savage, like ourselves, feels the oppression of his impotence before the powers of nature. But having in himself nothing that he respects more than power, he is willing to prostrate himself before his gods, without inquiring whether they are worthy of his worship. Pathetic and very terrible is the long history of cruelty and torture, of degradation and human sacrifice, endured in the hope of placating the jealous gods. Surely, the trembling believer thinks, when what is most precious has been freely given, their lust for blood must be appeased, and more will not be required. The religion of Moloch, as such creeds may be generically called, is in essence the cringing submission of the slave, who dare not, even in his heart, allow the thought that his master deserves no adulation. Since the independence of ideals is not yet acknowledged, power may be freely worshipped, and receive an unlimited respect despite its wanton infliction of pain. What is he describing here for us, generally speaking? Our present day? A future time? You have an idea?
I mean, I think it's sort of going back to that like cyclical thing where like I feel like he's like relating it back to like a past thing, but I feel like this could just be like the evolution of each individual like self. It's like you sort of like start off like as a child, like you like he's relating like nature to like mother nature, but I feel like that could also be like related to like as a child you kind of just like you do what you're told, and like as you grow up you realize that like you have like freedom to like think for yourself.
Right. Yeah, there's several things that he's saying here, right? And implying. But we'll start off perhaps with, the general one. He's kind of describing the brief history of humans, right? We find ourselves in this alien world. Imagine you're one of the first humans to have ever existed. Let's accept his worldview. Let's just assume it for a second. You've evolved from creatures that are like you in some respects, but also unlike you, right? You have capacities that they don't. You wake up, you find yourself in this world, you're looking around, and it's all very strange, right? But you know that there are forces bigger and badder than you, with more power and control than you. And so what might you do? Not having the history of science and philosophy and all this stuff. Well, you might start worshiping them, right? And what did we do in our past to appease these gods that we thought existed? Well, we engaged in ritual worship, human sacrifice, killed each other, sacrificed ourselves, right? Those forces beyond our control that we did not completely understand, that we did not have power over, We worship them. This is what he's describing here. And he calls this time, bereft of knowledge, bereft of a true understanding of how the universe works, as pathetic and very terrible. It was a long history of cruelty and torture, of degradation and human sacrifice, which we engaged in order to placate those jealous gods that we thought existed. And going on, he says, but gradually, as morality grows bolder, the claim of the ideal world begins to be felt, and worship, if it is not to cease, must be given to gods of another kind than those created by the savage. Some, though they feel the demands of this ideal, will still consciously reject them, still urging that naked power is worthy of worship. Such is the attitude inculcated in God's answer to Job out of the whirlwind. The divine power and knowledge are paraded, but of the divine goodness there is no hint. Such also is the attitude of those who, in our day, base their morality upon the struggle for survival, maintaining that the survivors are necessarily the fittest. But others, not content with an answer so repugnant to the moral sense, will adopt the position which we have become accustomed to regard as specially religious, maintaining that, in some hidden manner, the world of fact is really harmonious with the world of ideals. Thus man creates God, all-powerful and all good, the mystic unity of what is and what should be. And so at first, which we got from the last paragraph, we engage in these worship of things. But he said that we did not question whether they were worthy of our worship, if they existed at all. But obviously, human societies don't stay stagnant, right? Humans continue to develop. They continue to evolve and learn more about the world, see things more clearly, unmask the hidden workings of nature, right? And so our societies changed. Our ideas changed. Our views of the world changed slowly over time, right? This is what's always happening. What I think he's implying here, at least in some of these sentences, is not only that in our earlier stages we did not question whether the ideals and gods that we were beholding up are worthy of our worship, but also whether the things that we were worshiping were actually good. If you know the stories of the Bible, you may have heard about the story of Job, which he mentions here. And what happens to Job? Well, the dude's got everything. Okay, he's got the life. He's incredibly wealthy. He has a lot of land. He has a huge family. He has a wife and children. Everything is going great for him. And what happens? Well, Satan looks at him and looks to God and says, I bet this guy wouldn't worship you if you took away all of his stuff. He's just worshiping you because you've given him a lot, because you've blessed him. Take away all his things, he'll throw you to the wind. He doesn't really care about you. And God says, I bet you that's not true. Let's see what happens. And what happens to him? His whole life gets turned upside down. He loses all of his cattle. A terrible storm comes through, kills his children. He becomes sick. He has lost everything, even his health. He gets boils and suffers greatly. And throughout all of this, he's wondering, why is this happening? God, why is this happening to me? And his friends tell him, you need to curse God. Man, God did this to you? screw that guy. But, according to the story, he doesn't do that. He does end up asking God, hey, why did you do this to me, bro? What's going on? And God gives him a little talking to. And he's like, who are you to judge what I'm doing? You know nothing. You don't know what's going on. You don't have the same power that I do. But Job remains steadfast in his faith. In that story, though, Russell says, the divine power and knowledge are paraded, but of the divine goodness there is no hint. And he likens this also to some views that were popular during his day, like this neo-Darwinian view that the way that we should organize society and the way that we should treat ourselves is that those who are strongest and best should win. That's the way nature works. So that's the way our societies should work too. And he says, well, that's not so great a view, right? Those, like the primitive religions and primitive worldviews, are repugnant to the moral sense. And continuing on, he says, but the world of fact, after all, is not good, like these primitive worldviews, ideas, and ideals. And in submitting our judgment to it, there is an element of slavishness from which our thoughts must be purged. For in all things it is well to exalt the dignity of man by freeing him as far as possible from the tyranny of non-human power. When we have realized that power is largely bad, that man with his knowledge of good and evil is but a helpless atom in a world which has no such knowledge, the choice is again presented to us. Shall we worship force, or shall we worship goodness? Shall our God exist and be evil, or shall he be recognized as the creation of our own conscience? And so he brings up a number of important questions here. What should we be holding up as an ideal? Should it be power and might? Or should it be goodness? What do you think? What should we orient our lives towards? What is good and moral, or power? Yeah?
I mean, I think good and moral, I think, like he's said, like there's like a sense of freedom that comes from like deciding your own fate and like deciding, well, I guess fate as you can, but
sure. Whatever we can do, being those helpless atoms that we are,
yeah.
right? In this indifferent universe that continues to be uncaring to us.
Yeah. Like I think it's a responsibility because it's like we have like the capacity for moral and judgment, and so if we were to just like have that capacity and yet still just like disregard morals and judgment just for the purpose of like fear and anxiety that we have towards these forces and to just like appease them, like I feel like that only like oppresses us more and like restricts our freedom more.
I think Russell would probably agree. He's looking at our primitive worldviews and how we used to live and think, and he's like, that's not good. Look at how that has held us back. Look at the violence and bloodshed that has caused. So we need to change our thinking. And we need to reckon with the facts. And what does he think the facts are? There isn't an all-powerful God that's looking out for us that created us. We are just a part of this physical universe. God was a creation or an invention of ours in order to provide some kind of, security and psychological comfort, but a fiction nonetheless. And so what do we need to do? Well, we need to set aside those fictions. We need to idealize something different, not power. We need to take our fates in our own hands. So what we see is an evolution of idealizing power to goodness, or at least this is what he thinks should happen, right? No longer worshiping fictitious, all-powerful gods that are good because they're powerful, no. We need to realize that those worldviews of the past, those gods and goddesses that we used to worship, those fictitious religious and mythological systems no longer serve us. It's time to live more in accordance with truth, which he thinks involves giving them up. Shall we worship force, or shall we worship goodness? Shall our God exist and be evil, or shall he be recognized as the creation of our own conscience? The answer to this question is very momentous and affects profoundly our whole morality. The worship of force, to which Carlyle and Nietzsche and the creed of militarism have accustomed us, is the result of failure to maintain our own ideals against a hostile universe. It is itself a prostrate submission to evil, a sacrifice of our best to Moloch. If strength indeed is to be respected, let us respect rather the strength of those who refuse that false recognition of facts, which fails to recognize that facts are often bad. Let us admit that in the world we know, there are many things that would be better otherwise, and that the ideals to which we do and must adhere are not realized in the realm of matter. Let us preserve our respect for truth, for beauty, for the ideal of perfection which life does not permit us to attain, though none of these things meet with the approval of the unconscious universe. If power is bad, as it seems to be, let us reject it from our hearts. In this lies man's true freedom, in determination to worship only the God created by our own love of the good, to respect only the heaven which inspires the insight of our best moments. In action, in desire, we must submit perpetually to the tyranny of outside forces. But in thought, in aspiration, we are free. Free from our fellow men, free from the petty planet on which our bodies impotently crawl, free even while we live from the tyranny of death. Let us learn then that energy of faith, which enables us to live constantly in the vision of the good, and let us descend in action into the world of fact with that vision always before us. And so he brings up a few different ideas here. We did see at the start that this essay was written during a time in which he was more Platonic in his thinking, and so he is invoking some Platonic ideas here. If y'all can think all the way back to Unit 1, I made an offhand comment about the kind of metaphysics and worldview that Plato held. What did Plato believe in? He didn't think that this material world was all that there was. He thought there existed some sort of transcendent realm in which the forms existed. These perfect concepts that manifest imperfectly in our material realm of flesh and blood. And so what we see in Plato, and what we see in medieval philosophy and Christian philosophy as well, is this idea that there is some transcendent order that we ought to try to adhere to, though the world may be imperfect. And those ancient Greek Platonic philosophers, they held up three important forms, or transcendent ideals, that we ought to adhere to, that we ought to pursue, that we ought to seek and make manifest in our reality. The form of the true, of the good, and of the beautiful. which according to them, we're all linked up, interconnected and interdependent in some way. If something is true, it's also good and beautiful. If something is good, it's true and beautiful. If something is beautiful, it's also true and good. And so Russell is saying something similar here, right? We have failed to maintain our own ideals against a hostile universe. Science teaches us that our existence is a cosmic accident, that there's all this chaos and violence and death, that we're going to die, that there's imperfection, there's weakness of will. But we can't let ourselves be destroyed by that. We still need to reach for these things. We still need to try to make them happen. We should not submit to evil. What we should do is adhere to these ideals, preserving our respect for truth, for beauty, and perfection, which life does not permit us to attain, but which we should still strive for. And to contrast this kind of view, he brings up two philosophers, Carlyle and Nietzsche. And I'll just talk about Nietzsche because that's who I know better. Nietzsche, another super influential and important philosopher, 19th century figure, German. He had a bunch of spicy views. But he's somebody who saw how Western society was losing faith not only in the God of Christianity, but those founding narratives and mythologies that provided us with orientation, meaning, and purpose for thousands of years. And thus he exclaimed, God is dead, and we have killed him. And what he meant by that was, well, a few different things, but one of the things was Christianity gave rise to the project of natural science, which then undid our belief and faith in Christianity. And as our knowledge of science grew and we came to understand the world better, we saw that we were believing all of these fictions, although people didn't want to admit it. God didn't really exist. There's no objective moral standard that we're beholden to. Nature is cruel, and it's either conquer or be conquered. And he wishes for us to be honest about these facts, Nietzsche does, and to live in accordance with them, pitting our wills honestly against one another, seeing who wins. For he thought the underlying principle of reality that was organizing things was the desire or the drive to cultivate and exercise power. That's what he thought all living things are ultimately doing. And so we need to set aside these fictions, these beliefs in objective morality, in religion and Christianity, because they were making us meaner, weaker, and more stupid, making our lives worse. Now, Russell doesn't completely agree with Nietzsche and all of that, but his thought still influences us today, and I bet it's influencing Russell as well. And he says, if power is bad, let us reject it from our hearts. Our true freedom lies in determination to worship only the God created by our own love of the good. We need to create and set up our own ideal to strive after. Those ones that we were given in the past from those religions and primitive mythologies and worldviews aren't cutting it. They're not good enough. They're not right. We need to create our own value, or our own meaning, our own purpose in some way. That is what we are called to do, in determination. In thought and aspiration, we are free to do this, even though things in the outside world might not go as we plan. And he closes with this paragraph. Let us learn then that energy of faith which enables us to live constantly in the vision of the good, and let us descend in action into the world of fact with that vision always before us. These ideals should guide our action in reality. Perhaps with science as a foundation, because it's not going to do any good to reject, well, what we know to be true or beyond doubt. When the first opposition of fact and ideal grows fully visible, a spirit of fiery revolt, of fierce hatred of the gods, seems necessary to the assertion of freedom. To defy with Promethean constancy a hostile universe, to keep its evils always in view, always actively hated, to refuse no pain that the malice of power can invent, appears to be the duty of all who will not bow before the inevitable. But indignation is still a bondage, for it compels our thoughts to be occupied with an evil world. And in the fierceness of desire from which rebellion springs, there is a kind of self-assertion which it is necessary for the wise to overcome. Indignation is a submission of our own thoughts, but not of our desires. The Stoic freedom in which wisdom consists is found in the submission of our desires, but not of our thoughts. From the submission of our desires springs the virtue of resignation. From the freedom of our thoughts springs the whole world of art and philosophy, and the vision of beauty by which at last we half reconquer the reluctant world. But the vision of beauty is possible only to unfettered contemplation, to thoughts not weighted by the load of eager wishes. And thus, freedom comes only to those who no longer ask of life that it shall yield them any of those personal goods that are subject to the mutations of time. Okay, so what is he saying here? What do y'all think? How should we think? How should we live? To find true freedom, meaning, and fulfillment, what do we need to do? Mm-hmm.
There's like a acceptance that we have to like face with like evil and bad, but instead of like accepting like power from it, you sort of just accept it as a part of nature, and then that like it's like that destruction of like self, because like our desires, like we found, like is not like fully in our control, so we like we have to accept that. We have to accept the darkness, and then if we like submit our desires, then we have like the freedom of thought to like think for ourselves and find our own like virtues and philosophies.
Right. So what do we need to do in order to be free? We need to use our minds, right? Yes, a certain virtue and control comes from mastering your impulses and your desires and your appetites, right? This is the Stoic freedom that he mentions. The Stoics thought, you have all these desires and instincts and impulses, but if you want to be free, if you want to live a meaningful, fulfilling life, you need to develop self-control and self-mastery. You need to develop reason and live according to reason. And you can't let your emotions just flood you and get the best of you all the time, because that's going to cause you to do all this dumb stuff. It's going to lead you into problems. The Stoics don't think we can't be emotional, but they're saying you can't let your desires and emotions run your life. And he says that there is a certain wisdom in this, right? And though the world is evil, in some sense, things happen, we suffer, things don't go our way, we don't get that grade that we wanted on the writing assignment. We have to come to class and it sucks because you'd rather be laying in bed. He says we must caution against resentment and indignation. It's easy to just look out around at the world today and fall into despair and resentment and hatred and anger. I bet you all know people who are angry, right? Who are resentful. Are they happy? What are they like? Do you like spending time around them? It makes sense why we would feel that way, right? The world is unfair. It's not just. Things are not completely within your control. We are all striving after these dreams, these hopes. We don't know if they're going to come true, right? We don't control everything out there. There's a lot of suffering in that striving. The universe might be hostile, and it is good to keep its evil in view, but we can't fall into nihilism and resentment and despair. What we need to do is utilize the capacities that we have to create, to make things better, to think, to do philosophy. Right? Of course the philosopher is going to say this, right? We should try to make the world a better place if we can. But where our true freedom lies is in our thinking, right? And from the freedom of our thoughts springs the whole world of art and philosophy, and the vision of beauty by which at last we half reconquer the reluctant world. But the vision of beauty is possible only to unfettered contemplation, to thoughts not weighted by the load of eager wishes. And thus, freedom comes only to those who no longer ask of life that it shall yield them any of those personal goods that are subject to the mutations of time. So, what should we spend our lives doing if we want to be happy, secure, fulfilled? Chasing after the next best iPhone? Oh, I know. Buying the next new fashion piece that we just saw on the runway. How about trying to make everybody like us? How about getting famous? Okay, you're all shaking your heads. No, we're not supposed to do that. What are we supposed to do instead? Yeah.
I think he's just saying, like, kind of just, it's really simple, just like be a good person. Like, don't chase after, like, your selfish desires, like, just help other people and, like, be good.
Yes, yeah. That's a part of it. And this is like, it's such a simple general idea that we see pop up in philosophy a lot, but it's one that philosophers keep coming back to. And this idea has become more popular nowadays as well. True happiness and fulfillment is not to be found in acquiring material things. It's something, your happiness, your fulfillment, your security is something that you need to grab, something that you need to achieve for yourself. It's not going to come by having the best house, by having the Lamborghini, by having all the drugs and sex, striving after those things. but rather engaging in contemplation and no longer asking of life that it shall yield them any of those personal goods that are subject to the mutations of time. We need to orient ourselves towards this stuff, right? The true, the good, the beautiful. Engage in thought and philosophy. Use our freedom of thought. And continuing on, he says, although the necessity of renunciation is evidence of the existence of evil, yet Christianity, in preaching it, has shown a wisdom exceeding that of the Promethean philosophy of rebellion. It must be admitted that, of the things we desire, some, though they prove impossible, are yet real goods. Others, however, as ardently longed for, do not form part of a fully purified ideal. The belief that what must be renounced is bad, though sometimes false, is far less often false than untamed passion supposes. In the creed of religion, by providing a reason for proving that it is never false, has been the means of purifying our hopes by the discovery of many austere truths. And so we can rebel endlessly against the universe, right? And rail against it and be angry and be resentful. But I think Russell believes that a fulfilling life goes beyond that. Perhaps that is a stage in your existential development, but you probably shouldn't stop there. There is in resignation, he says, a further good element. Even real goods, when they are unattainable, ought not to be fretfully desired. To every man comes, sooner or later, the great renunciation. For the young, there is nothing unattainable. A good thing desired with the whole force of a passionate will, and yet impossible, is to them not credible. Yet by death, by illness, by poverty, or by the voice of duty, we must learn, each one of us, that the world is not made for us, and that however beautiful may be the things we crave, fate may nevertheless forbid them. It is the part of courage, when misfortune comes, to bear without repining the ruin of our hopes, to turn away our thoughts from vain regrets. This degree of submission to power is not only just and right, it is the very gate of wisdom. And so, we might say, kind of like some Eastern philosophies, what is being implied here is the necessity of, in some way, accepting what is. And you know this psychologically, right? You cannot be psychologically helpful if you just deny. You have to accept so you can process and move through, right? The word he uses is renunciation. Not renunciation of all there is in the universe, but I think what he is invoking here is an idea that, look, you need to realize and accept that not all your desires are going to be fulfilled, that you're going to suffer, that bad things are going to happen, that you're not completely in control of everything. Recognizing the existential facts of your existence. But passive renunciation, he says, is not the whole of wisdom. For not by renunciation alone can we build a temple for the worship of our own ideals. Haunting foreshadowings of the temple appear in the realm of imagination, in music and architecture, in the untroubled kingdom of reason, and in the golden sunset magic of lyrics, where beauty shines and glows, remote from the touch of sorrow, remote from the fear of change, remote from the failures and disenchantments of the world of fact. In the contemplation of these things, the vision of heaven will shape itself in our hearts, giving at once a touchstone to judge the world about us, and an inspiration by which to fashion to our needs whatever is not incapable of serving as a stone in the sacred temple. So renunciation alone is not going to get us where we want to go. What we need to use are, well, the capacities that we have to build this better world for ourselves, to allow us to traverse the path oriented towards this stuff with reason. Music, architecture, lyrics. Yes, the world sucks. Yes, there is sorrow. There is change. But we cannot linger and just fall into that forever. Fall into that despair. Through contemplation, we can better form this ideal with which to orient ourselves and shape reality to mirror it. We need to use our power of thought. Except for those rare spirits that are born without sin, there is a cavern of darkness to be traversed before that temple can be entered. The gate of the cavern is despair, and its floor is paved with the gravestones of abandoned hopes. There, self must die. There, the eagerness, the greed of untamed desire must be slain. For only so can the soul be freed from the empire of fate. But out of the cavern, the gate of renunciation leads again to the daylight of wisdom, by whose radiance a new insight, a new joy, a new tenderness shine forth to gladden the pilgrim's heart. And so I think this describes for us quite well the existential journey that we must go on. We're going to have to change. We're going to have to transform ourselves and evolve from people that rest easily in the suffering and enjoy our despair and depression. No, we cannot stay in that. We need to go through the cavern of despair and come out the other side. Yes, there's suffering. Our hopes have been destroyed in our lives. But that's not the end of our story, right? Or it need not be. And maybe if you just allow yourself to stay the way that you are. But your life doesn't have to be sorrowful like that, and despairing, and full of suffering and regret and resentment. You can evolve and transform and become better and wiser and more knowledgeable. We are going to have to achieve some sort of self-mastery to do this, right? It's not going to be easy. But if we are willing to go through that process, if we're willing to put in the work of transforming ourselves, of living more in accordance with these things, it will lead again to the daylight of wisdom, by whose radiance a new insight, a new joy, a new tenderness shine forth to gladden our hearts. What do you think about that? What do you think about what he's proposing here? Is it cool? Is it stupid? Yeah.
I think I definitely agree, especially with like the last part about like the self must die, because I've had like experiences where I feel like I had almost like the ego death from having like an existential crisis.
Yeah.
And it really changes your view on everything. Like I always thought I was like I pretty much lived like a life of like caring and understanding other people, but it wasn't until I really had like that ego death that like I really understood like the like what he's describing, like the joy, the new tenderness, like it's something about like having like letting go of your past self or like who you thought you were, what you thought you knew, to really get to like that point. So yeah, I think he makes a good point.
Okay, what do the rest of y'all think? What thoughts and feelings are popping up for you?
I mean, I agree. I think like that death itself is definitely, because I feel like it like both like sort of individualizes your experience, but it also like creates this like interconnectedness where it's not like you have to like desire something from the world, and so like that sort of makes it so like the world is like this thing that holds all these things that are unattainable, but like I feel like when
You think that's the wrong view?
yeah, I feel like there's more of an interconnectedness to it. It's not like there's this like gate that you have to like go through and this like holds all your desires. I think if you can like let go of like your, I guess, earthly desires, like pleasures and shit.
No, that's fine. Yeah.
Then you like allow yourself to like fulfill your own desires like from yourself through like viewing life as like beautiful, and that like in itself is contentment. So like if you can view beauty in anything, then like you won't have that like emptiness that you're trying to fill with other things in your life.
And that is what we should be striving after.
Yeah.
Like contentment instead of fulfilling the desires of our body.
Yeah, I guess just like beauty. Like that's what I really like about his take specifically, is he really emphasizes that like beauty, because I feel like with a lot of like Stoic philosophies, it sort of like makes it so it's like, well, you know, I feel like we all want some sort of pleasure out of life. Like if you're not experiencing pleasure, then like there's no balance to that like suffering. So I think, you know, when there's like those like radical Stoics that will just like live
That are ascetic, right? And they'll live in a cave and they won't eat stuff and like, yeah.
It's like I feel like he's touching on beauty because it's like it's sort of touching on the fact that like we still need like some sort of pleasure, like we still need some balance and some things to live for and some things to like desire. It just doesn't have to be so materialistic.
That stuff doesn't have to be our be all end all.
Yeah.
And perhaps shouldn't be. I don't know what you all think, but maybe you believe that. When, without the bitterness of impotent rebellion, we have learned both to resign ourselves to the outward rules of fate and to recognize that the non-human world is unworthy of our worship, it becomes possible at last so to transform and refashion the unconscious universe, so to transmute it in the crucible of imagination, that a new image of shining gold replaces the old idol of clay. In all the multiform facts of the world, in visual shapes of trees and mountains and clouds, in the events of the life of man, even in the very omnipotence of death, the insight of creative idealism can find the reflection of a beauty which its own thoughts first made. In this way, mind asserts its subtle mastery over the thoughtless forces of nature. The more evil the material with which it deals, the more thwarting to untrained desire. The greater is its achievement in inducing the reluctant rock to yield up its hidden treasures. The prouder its victory in compelling the opposing forces to swell the pageant of its triumph. Of all the arts, tragedy is the proudest, the most triumphant, for it builds its shining citadel in the very center of the enemy's country, on the very summit of his highest mountain. From its impregnable watchtowers, his camps and arsenals, his columns and forts, all are revealed. Within its walls, the free life continues, while the legions of death and pain and despair, and all the servile captains of tyrant fate, afford the burghers of that dauntless city new spectacles of beauty. Happy those sacred ramparts, thrice happy the dwellers on that all-seeing eminence. Honor to those brave warriors who, through countless ages of warfare, have preserved for us the priceless heritage of liberty, and have kept undefiled by sacrilegious invaders the home of the unsubdued. And so, in order to achieve this transformation, so that we can reform the world in our own image, in some sense, we do have to accept the world for what it is, or at least recognize it for what it is. Maybe accept isn't the right word, because we want to change it, right? And he says, when we have learned both to resign ourselves to the outward rules of fate and to recognize the non-human world as unworthy of our worship, it becomes possible at last so to transform and refashion it, so that we can create a better world. But the beauty of tragedy does but make visible a quality which, in more or less obvious shapes, is present always and everywhere in life. In the spectacle of death, in the endurance of intolerable pain, and in the irrevocableness of a vanished past, there is a sacredness, an overpowering awe, a feeling of the vastness, the depth, the inexhaustible mystery of existence, in which, as by some strange marriage of pain, the sufferer is bound to the world by bonds of sorrow. In these moments of insight, we lose all eagerness of temporary desire, all struggling and striving for petty ends, all care for the little trivial things that, to a superficial view, make up the common life of day by day. We see, surrounding the narrow raft, illuminated by the flickering light of human comradeship, the dark ocean on whose rolling waves we toss for a brief hour. From the great night without, a chill blast breaks in upon our refuge. All the loneliness of humanity amid hostile forces is concentrated upon the individual soul, which must struggle alone with what of courage it can command, against the whole weight of a universe that cares nothing for its hopes and fears. Victory in this struggle with the powers of darkness is the true baptism into the glorious company of heroes, the true initiation into the overmastering beauty of human existence. From that awful encounter of the soul with the outer world, enunciation, wisdom, and charity are born. And with their birth, a new life begins. To take into the inmost shrine of the soul the irresistible forces whose puppets we seem to be, death and change, the irrevocableness of the past, and the powerlessness of man before the blind hurry of the universe from vanity to vanity. To feel these things and know them is to conquer them. What do you think he's saying there? How should we live our lives? What should we use our minds or spirits or whatever you want to call them to do? Oh, yes. To acknowledge them, right? And yeah, maybe there's some truth in using that word indifferent. Although maybe we could say acknowledge and feel and process, and to come out the other side. Not give in to the easy path, which is, well, none of this makes a difference anyway. My existence doesn't mean anything. I might as well, just do drugs and fuck until I die and be sad. That is how some people live, right? That is how they think. They feel the sorrow of the world. They feel their hopes and dreams destroyed. They think their existence is meaningless, and they're like, well, I'll just throw my hands up then. What's the point? I'll just follow my subjective desires. I don't owe anybody anything. In fact, I don't even like people. Right? Well, perhaps there is some truth in that. But Russell is saying, no. To take into the shrine of the soul the irresistible forces whose puppets we seem to be, the fact that we're going to die, the fact that there's change, the fact that we can't change the past, that we're powerless before the forces of nature and the universe. To understand that, to wrestle with that, but to come out the other side still oriented towards this stuff and wanting to try to make the world more in accordance with that. That is what heroism is. That's what we should be doing. That is how we conquer them. This is the reason why the past, he says, has such magical power. The beauty of its motionless and silent pictures is like the enchanted purity of late autumn, when the leaves, though one breath would make them fall, still glow against the sky in golden glory. The past does not change or strive. Like Duncan, after life's fitful fever, it sleeps well. What was eager and grasping, what was petty and transitory, has faded away. The things that were beautiful and eternal shine out of it like stars in the night. Its beauty, to a soul not worthy of it, is unendurable. But to a soul which has conquered fate, it is the key of religion. The life of man, viewed outwardly, is but a small thing in comparison with the forces of nature. The slave is doomed to worship time and fate and death, because they are greater than anything he finds in himself, and because all his thoughts are of things which they devour. But, great as they are, to think of them greatly, to feel their passionless splendor, is greater still. And such thought makes us free men. We no longer bow before the inevitable in oriental subjection, but we absorb it and make it a part of ourselves. To abandon the struggle for private happiness, to expel all eagerness of temporary desire, to burn with passion for eternal things, this is emancipation, and this is the free man's worship. And this liberation is effected by a contemplation of fate. For fate itself is subdued by the mind, which leaves nothing to be purged by the purifying fire of time. And so, in contrast to the kind of philosophy that he is referencing here, Eastern philosophy, which we're going to look at in this class, Buddhism and Taoism, which you might say encourages a kind of radical acceptance and quietism to the motions of the universe, not railing against it, but just accepting it and moving with it. That's a small part of the puzzle, but, Russell is saying, We don't just bow before it. We don't just bow before the forces of nature and merely accept it. We must absorb it and make it a part of ourselves. This may involve abandoning just chasing after our own personal desires, expelling the eagerness of temporary desire. And it involves burning with passion, he says, for eternal things. This is what true liberation is. Security, happiness, fulfillment. This is what he calls the free man's worship. To understand and internalize and absorb the beauty of the cosmos. And to make it a part of your existence. Let's finish this off. United with his fellow men by the strongest of all ties, the tie of a common doom, the free man finds that a new vision is with him always, shedding over every daily task the light of love. The life of man is a long march through the night, surrounded by invisible foes, tortured by weariness and pain, towards a goal that few can hope to reach, and where none may tarry long. One by one as they march, our comrades vanish from our sight, seized by the silent orders of omnipotent death. Very brief is the time in which we can help them, in which their happiness or misery is decided. Be it ours to shed sunshine on their path, to lighten their sorrows by the balm of sympathy, to give them the pure joy of a never-tiring affection, to strengthen failing courage, to instill faith in hours of despair. Let us not weigh in grudging scales their merits and demerits, but let us think only of their need, of the sorrows, the difficulties, perhaps the blindnesses that make the misery of their lives. Let us remember that they are fellow sufferers in the same darkness, actors in the same tragedy as ourselves. And so, when their day is over, when their good and their evil have become eternal by the immortality of the past, be it ours to feel that where they suffered, where they failed, no deed of ours was the cause. But wherever a spark of the divine fire kindled in their hearts, we were ready with encouragement, with sympathy, with brave words in which high courage glowed. Brief and powerless is man's life. On him and all his race the slow, sure doom falls pitiless and dark. Blind to good and evil, reckless of destruction, omnipotent matter rolls on in its relentless way. For man, condemned today to lose his dearest, tomorrow himself to pass through the gates of darkness, it remains only to cherish, ere yet the blow falls, the lofty thoughts that ennoble his little day, disdaining the coward terrors of the slave of fate, to worship at the shrine that his own hands have built. Undismayed by the empire of chance, to preserve a mind free from the wanton tyranny that rules his outward life, proudly defiant of the irresistible forces that tolerate for a moment his knowledge and his condemnation, to sustain alone a weary but unyielding Atlas, the world that his own ideals have fashioned, despite the trampling march of unconscious power. This is the kind of philosophy of life that Russell is encouraging us to reflect on and to live. One which is partly Platonic, partly Stoic, existential, that utilizes our freedom of thought to create for ourselves an ideal of how we want the world to be, and then doing our darndest to bring it in existence. Treating others with love and compassion, recognizing that they too are going to die. that they too suffer and know not what they do. But the religions, the mythologies, the narratives of the past are not going to serve well for this purpose. Instead, we need to kind of craft our own ideal. What we want the world to be, that is informed by the true, the good, and the beautiful. So what do you think of this view? Does it resonate with you? Or is reading this just a waste of time? What do you think? Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think I agree with a lot of his points. I think like reading it definitely, because like I've been like reading a lot of like, well, I've been learning a lot about like Stoics and like their philosophies and sort of how like I feel like in this day and age it's really easy to live like, or I guess like misconstrue like hedonism and like short-term pleasure, because that's sort of like, you know, everything that sort of connects us is based on like some sort of like, I don't know, like entertainment, like movies, you know.
That's kind of the environment that we're swimming in, right?
Yeah, it's like, it's kind of what's like connecting us, because like we don't really have like culture and community like we used to, and like tight-knit like communities, like which like can be really good. It's just like it can be good to like have like broader senses of community, but it's also like I feel like we've sort of found community in like material things, and I feel like that's sort of like driven us to like stray away from like long-term fulfillment instead of just like short-term, because it's like it's, you know, more beneficial for like companies to be giving you like short-term things that you have to like buy, like read, purchase, and update and stuff like that. And I feel like it's important to like sort of step back from that in a stoic sense of like detaching from a outer source of what essentially your environment is telling you want, and instead just like really assessing what you actually want and not just what you're being told you should have.
So actually reflecting on what you want the world to be like, not just accepting what society tells you is good and right. To bring up Fromm again, right, who says you should really reflect on whether or not your desires are authentic and your own. Yeah? And you like this idea, these ideas of self-mastery, foregoing materialism, materialistic hedonism, love, this fashioning of the world in this idealized image that we create with the power of the mind, based on the true, good, and beautiful. Anybody else? Okay, well, you should really reflect on this and talk about this with the people in your lives. This is not the only philosophy of life we're going to look at, but it's one possible path that you might take, that you might live into in order to weather the sufferings of your existence. Because you do suffer, and you will suffer. But it's going to be up to you to decide how you're going to navigate and traverse that. Okay. Thank you for coming. I will see you all next week. Have a good weekend.